Psalms 18 is one of those Psalms that if you don't pay attention and read it deeply, spiritually, socially, from every viewpoint, and culturally, you're going to miss what the Psalms is talking about when it relates to David, when it relates to God, when it relates to God relating back to his people. Psalms 18 has a lot to offer us in 2026. It's broken down into parts. There's 50 verses in Psalm 18, which is a lot, but whenever you really look into it, there's sections within Psalms 18. The first section is the thesis section. First three verses, Psalms 18, 1 through 3. But to understand what's going on, you have to read the note that's on the top. It says, to the choir master, a Psalms of David, the servant of the Lord, who addressed the words of this song to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hands of all of his enemies and from the hands of Saul, he said. And so the Psalms 18 is David's testimony after God delivers him from the Philistines, from Saul, from his son, all the trials and tribulations that we read about in the stories of David. Now David sits down and he writes Psalms 18. And the first three verses is going to be called the thesis for the psalm. So this is the thesis. He writes, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, of my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. I am saved from all of my enemies. David makes a declaration of love to God. He's saying, I love you, Lord. He's declaring something about what's going on the inside of his heart. But then he goes on and he calls God his rock. He calls God his fortress. He calls God his deliverer, his shield, his stronghold, his horn of his salvation. What does this mean? To understand this, you have to understand ancient Near Eastern Israel. You have to understand the environment that David is in when he's running from his enemies. He's in the wilderness, he's in the desert, he's in a hill country. When David is calling God his rock, his fortress, his stronghold, his deliverer, he's taking the pieces in the desert, he's taking the pieces in the struggle, he's taking the pieces of his trial and saying, hey, I'm going to take these characteristics and relate them back to God. So the word rock, when David is saying God is my rock, he's not talking about an actual pebble. He's talking of a bedrock or a cliff, a high up hill, cliff, stronghold, way up in the air where he's going to get there by climbing up and an army is not going to be able to get to him very easily because remember, David is spending all this time running from his enemies. And so sometimes he would find a high up place in some rocky cliffed area, maybe with a cave inside of it, and he would hide out. And David is saying, God is my rock. He's my high up cliff where I can find a steady, stable foundation up in the air where I'll be protected. And that's what David is relating to God as. When he says that God is his fortress, historically, you have to think about it. What is a fortress in the time period of David? What is a fortress in the time period of David? A fortress was a defense structure, most likely in an elevated place. It had thick walls, narrow access points, watchtowers, and it was built to withstand raids and sieges. So it's not very easy to get inside of a fortress. And most likely this fortress, it could be all the way up on a cliff up high in the air. Very possible. So now you have a high place, a fortress, and it's going to make it very difficult for an enemy to get to you. And this is what David is saying about God. He is my fortress. A fortress is meant to do a few things. You can be outnumbered and still survive because of a fortress. The Alamo down in Texas is a fortress. The Alamo, they surrounded the Alamo and they still won. The people inside of the fortress won because of the protection the fortress provided. So you can be outnumbered and still win because a fortress provides protection. And that's what God is to his people. He is protection. But protection is not just about feeling, it's about structure and defense. It's a place where the enemy can't just rush in and get you. And that falls into what David said about God being a deliverer. The Hebrew idea of a rescuer, someone who pulls you out when you're trapped. In that culture that David was in, deliverance meant being saved from a strong army, a bloody feud situation, unjust rulers, an ambush or raid. David repeatedly escaped situations where he should have died. He's saying God doesn't just hide him away, he extracts him, he delivers him. God doesn't just hide his people into a cave, he delivers them from that situation. So God is a deliverer. We will face our hardships and our troubles that we face in life, but God is a deliverer and he will extract us from those situations just because God is our deliverer. David calls God his refuge. He calls God his refuge. I take refuge, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. God is a refuge. A refuge is a safe shelter, just like a fortress, just like if you're up in a high cliff area inside of a cave, a safe shelter area. Shelter provides protection, a place of safety rather than comfort. So you might not be very comfortable in this shelters that God has put you in, but God's object is not to make you comfortable. Sometimes in those seasons, God's objective is to give you a place of safety. And so we can learn from David because David's life involved literally running from danger, from enemies, even pretending to be insane to the Philistine people. A refuge is the place you run to and not a place that you admire from a distance. So we need to be a people running to God and allowing Him to become our refuge and not just admire God from a distance. And then David calls God his shield. A shield A shield in those days would cover up the entire body of a person. Shields were huge. And so when David is calling God a shield, that means that God takes every hit, every arrow, every spear, every word, every hit. God takes it all. And that's what Jesus did for us on the cross. He took every sin punishment that we deserved upon himself. He becomes our shield on the cross, our shield of our salvation. And that's another type of protection that we have. And then David calls God a horn of my salvation. What does that mean? In Bible prophecy, you will see the beast with all these horns on the beast's head. And what I believe that is that each horn represents a world leader. But when David is talking about God being the horn of his salvation, you gotta think about what does he mean by that when he's writing it down? What is David possibly thinking of? And it's very possible David is thinking about animals. He's thinking about bulls, oxen, rams, and these animals symbolize strength, power, victory. So when David is calling God the horn of my salvation, he's saying God is my strength. God is where my power comes from. God is where my victory comes from. Horns are also tied to kingship and might. And that goes back to what I said with the whole Bible prophecy thing. I believe that each horn represents a king of a nation. Horns represent kingship and might. And that's what David is saying about God, is that God is his mighty king. That ultimately God sits on the throne. God gets the final say. And then in Israel's worship, horns were used at the altar, a place associated with mercy and help. So horns can carry a strong help idea or ideology also, but they were used at the altar before God. So they can mean mercy, help, might, strength, power, victory. They can mean all of these things. The horn of my salvation. God is the most powerful strength that saves you and me. Our winning force, our mighty rescuer, the one who breaks the enemy's advantage. David knew and he saw, and we have the opportunity to experience this same exact side of God as David did, because God does not change. He's the same as yesterday, today, and forever. Second part of Psalms 18 is the crisis part. In the crisis part, David says, the cords of death encompass me. The torrent of destruction assail me. The cords of Shiloh entangle me, and the snares of death confront me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I cried out for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. This is another cultural thing. You have to understand a little bit about culture, what's going on, why is David writing this stuff, but also some common sense. So the cords and the snares that are trying to destroy David, that language, it points to ropes, nets, and traps used to catch animals. So in David's world, enemies didn't always fight fair. They try to ambush you, set traps, lay out plans. A lot like what you see in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq. The enemies over there, they will set these booby traps. Whenever I was in the military, they told us about the, what's it called? Not the landmines, but the other thing. It's been a while. But they would take trash and put these like strings, and then if you trip over the strings, it could be a bomb. And so they set these booby traps, and they taught us how to spot stuff like that whenever I was in boot camp. But in David's time, it was very common for his enemies to set ambushes and traps and lay out plans to try to bring death upon whoever it is that they are trying to bring death upon. And David is one of these guys in the Old Testament where he kills thousands upon thousands of people in war and combat situations. So obviously people want this guy dead. But now David's on the run. And the Philistines don't just want him dead. Saul wants him dead. His son wants him dead. Everyone that he ever loved betrayed him. Everyone wants him dead. And so everybody's setting traps for him, not just the Philistines, but his own people as well. And David turns to God and says, hey, my enemies are setting traps for me. Not only do I have to face my enemies setting traps for me, I also have to face floods and flash floods. And when we think flash floods, these torrents that David talks about in verse 4, the torrents of destruction assail me. So now not only is David dealing with people, he's dealing with just nature, just based on the way that the weather operated in that area that David was in that desert area. There was a lot of deadly flash floods, and you did not really have a warning when these flash floods would happen. So it just kind of happened out of nowhere. And David was dealing with that kind of stuff. And so it makes sense that it says that God is my rock. David needs a high up place, a fortress, to protect himself not only from his enemies, but from natural disasters, from the storms that the earth itself will wage against him. We are not immune from the consequence of a storm coming through. We're in a broken world, and so everything's broken. And these flash floods are part of it. If you're from Texas, you got tornadoes. If you're from the Midwest, you got the snow. As God's people, we are not immune to these circumstances. But we can rely back on the Word of God and the promises that God is our rock, our fortress, our deliverer, our refuge. If we lean on Him, we seek Him in those moments with flash floods happening in David's life, and then you got people trying to set traps to kill him. Death is ever present in front of David. In Hebrew poetry, death and Shiloh are often described like a realm that has cords, gates, pains. So cords is like it grabs and drags you down. And then gates, you get shut in and there's no way out. And then pains are like birth pains, the crushing pains. And so when David is talking about death, he's describing or he's trying to bring about an imagery within the poetry that he's writing in Psalms of being grabbed and dragged down as far as he can, kind of like Sing Sen. Or like if he walked into a room and the door got shut on him and there's no way out, or just birth pains. And David is describing this when he's talking about death in Shiloh. It's not a fun and comfortable experience whenever you have people trying to destroy you, when you have just the circumstance of living in a broken world coming down on you. So that is the crisis section. I want to skip over the theophany section and go straight to the deliverance section. Because the deliverance section points right back at the crisis section. He says in verse 16, He sent me on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. So David is pointing back at the crisis. He's talking about in the crisis, the torrents of destructions, the flash floods. He's talking about the cords of death encompass me. But then right here he's saying, He drew me out of many waters. He's referring back to the flash floods. He's saying that he sent from on high in heaven and he took me. He took me. What does that mean? It means that he extracted him. He became David's deliverer. He took me. He delivered David from many waters from the flash floods. He rescued me from my strong enemies. So now David is saying that he protected him from those who were setting traps for him, from those who hated him. And he brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because his delight was in me. So verses 16 through 19 point back to verses 4 through 6. So you got verses 4 through 6 being the crisis, and then verses 16 through 19 being the deliverance. Then you get to the theophany stage of the psalm. And remember, the theophany stage is going to be the manifestation of God Himself on earth in some way, shape, or form. Like when Moses was standing before the burning bush. That's a theophany. There's a theophany in Psalms 18, verses 7 through 15. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read a few verses, but it's describing God coming down from heaven in great might and great power and great authority. In verse 7, then the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked, because he was angry. And then verse 11, he made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds, dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, hailstorms and coals of fire broke through the clouds. And then 15, then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world laid bare. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of your breath, of your nostrils. And when you have time, go back through there and read it. And what you got going on here is God is showing up. God is showing up in a way that in the middle of the painful season, the chaos, in the middle of the chaos, God shows up with judgment to put everything back in order. We see the same thing play out in Genesis 1, verse 1 and 2. And what I mean by that, for some reason, whenever God shows up, He shows up during chaos. And so when you're reading Genesis 1, verse 1 and verse 2, in the Hebrew, in the original language, what you got going on here is there's a lot of chaos going on. And God seems to show up with His Spirit to take all of the chaos and put it in order. Takes all the chaos and He puts it all in order, but He does it in a way where the chaos itself stays in order. And that's a confusing topic. But David is going through hardship. He's going through problems with the weather patterns changing and flash floods, and his enemies are trying to destroy him. And it's like everything around David is just complete chaos and everything's out of control. And so God shows up as complete chaos, but everything is not out of control. God is showing up with everything in control. But when He shows up, those who cause the chaos will find chaos from God. And those who trust in God will find peace from God. The same exact power that brings us peace, the same exact power that brings us comfort, the same exact power that brings us refuge as believers, brings our enemies the opposite of that. It brings our enemies chaos, destruction, and just complete annihilation. God is not passive. When He shows up as a divine warrior. Smoke in the fire in verse 8 is God's holy power and His burning wrath. The dark clouds in verse 9 and verse 11 is God's majesty and His hiddenness, plus God's majesty working side by side. God shows up both hidden and magnified. He's not just a tame pet God that a lot of denominations nowadays like to think that they can put God in a box. You cannot put God in a box. The thunder, the hail, the lightning that we see in verses 12 and 14 are the weapons that God uses in battle. So the point is that God didn't just send help. He came as the warrior king. He rode on the cherubim. And when you think cherubim, think of the altar, the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark of the Covenant was built, there's cherubim on both sides. And this ark is the throne of God. That's where God sits in the Holy of Holies. So when David is describing God as riding on the cherubim, he must be thinking about the Ark of the Covenant, the throne within the Holy of Holies, where the sacrifices are being made at. But David is describing him as riding on the cherubim in verse 10. He rode on a cherubim and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. I'm thinking about the Ark of the Covenant because the way the Ark of the Covenant is, the wings create the seats for the Ark of the Covenant is designed like a throne. God sits on it. His presence is on it. And so that's what I'm thinking of when I'm reading verse 10. But there's three things that we can find within that verse is that God moves in royal authority, or God's help comes swiftly, and the rescue is not human driven, it's heaven driven, it's Yahweh driven. So it's intentionally over the top to magnify God. David piles on the imageries on purpose in order to magnify God and who God is. So when we're reading this theophany in verses 7 through 15, we have to understand who God is. God is not just some deity on a throne millions of miles up in the air in some other dimension. He is a personal, relational God that wants a relationship with you and I. And He's going to defend you against your enemies. Not only defend you against your enemies, but in verse 14, 15, it says He uses the lightning as arrows to rebuke and to blast the sea and the earth being exposed. God brings judgment. Even though David is the only one being rescued, verses 7 through 15 includes God's aiming his power outward because he's going to rescue you and me and anyone else that chooses to follow him. God is breaking the enemy's advantage and overturning the chaos that was swallowing up David. The cords of death encompass me, the tyrants of destruction assail me, the cords of Shiloh entangle me, the snares of death confront me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. And then the Lord showed up. And he did not show up as like this hippie version of Jesus that people from the 70s think Jesus is going to show up as. He showed up as a mighty warrior, ready to defend and protect his people and to bring judgment upon anyone that was trying to hurt his people. God descends in power, and God's hand grabs David and rescues him, extracts him from that situation. Now, there's more to this, right? There's way more to this story that, God didn't just come to extract David from the bad situation. There's more to it. When we get to the David's integrity part of the song, Psalm 18 verse 20 through 27, David says, "The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he's rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was blameless before him. I kept myself from the guilt. So the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. With the merciful, you show yourself merciful. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the pure, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you make yourself seem crooked or treacherous, for you save a humble people. But the Haiti eyes you bring down." David is not saying that he has no sin. David is recognizing the covenant faithfulness of not rebelling against God. God is merciful to those who are merciful. God is pure and loving to those who try to live out a pure and loving life. God is going to oppress or to oppose those who live out crooked and prideful ways. God rewards righteousness. Being made right with God through Jesus Christ is how you become part of the righteousness category. This idea that you can become righteous apart from God is delusional, is ludicrous. David definitely was not a perfect person, but there is a lesson that we can learn that God will allow us to face the consequence of our sin. But David did nothing wrong. He did not wrong Saul. He did not wrong his son. He did not wrong nature. He didn't do anything to get all these people to come against him. Maybe the Philistines, because he was killing a bunch of the giants and he killed a bunch of Philistines. But that's a whole nother situation because at the time he was part of an army. And when you go to war, people die. So David was blameless in that sense. He did not do anything wrong to anyone for them to try to destroy him. They only wanted him to be destroyed because they were jealous of him and they were jealous that he was gaining in popularity. He had the favor of God and man on his side. Saul was upset because Samuel told Saul that he would no longer be the king of Israel. So he had all these oppositions and all the hatred and all the anger against David had nothing to do with David. It had everything to do with those people that were trying to destroy David. And God saw. He saw the corruption. He saw the evil. He saw the betrayal. And he saw most of all that these people lifted up their swords against David for absolutely no reason. And so God comes down and says, hey, I'm going to bring my judgment upon those people. One of the biggest mistakes that we make as Christians is that we think that we can just take a step back and let God do what God's going to do. In Psalms 18, verses 28 through 45, we get to the section that God is going to use David. And the way I would title this section is God empowers David for victory. God empowers David for victory. God gives light, strength, training for battle, and success over enemies. Repeated theme is that God, the victory is God enabled and not self-made, and it ends with the nations submitting and enemies fading. God is going to empower his people to be victorious in life. In verses 7 through 15, we see God come down in this great and mighty power. But then David makes a comment in verse 34. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow. And then in verse 37, I pursued my enemies and overtook them and did not turn back till they were consumed. It says in verse 39, for you equip me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me I destroyed. They cried out for help, but there was none to save. And they cried out to the Lord, but he did not answer them. That's interesting. They cried out to the Lord. They cried out to Yahweh, and he did not answer them. Christians may very well, church going people may very well come against you, but if they come against you falsely, God will empower the other person to defend themselves in such a unique way that you would not be able to say that they did it on their own. It doesn't matter if you went to church all your life and you worship God at the same pulpit all your life. It doesn't matter if you preached at the pulpit all your life. The moment you choose to mess with the anointing person of God. You choose to fight a war that you are not strong enough to win. David was empowered not by his own strength, but by God's strength. And we can be empowered by God's strength. But this goes back to, are we blameless? Did we do something to cause the other person to come against us? If not, we are in Psalms 18 power. Then the seventh section, David praises God. David praises God, the final praise and covenant conclusion from David to God. David praises and worships God. The Lord lives, blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation, the God who gave me vengeance and subdued peoples underneath me, who rescued me from my enemies. Yes, you exalted me above those who rose against me. You deliver me from the man of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord. Among the nations I will sing your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and show steadfast love to his anointed, to David and to his offspring forever. This promise is not just for David, it's for his offspring. When you choose to take on a unnecessary war against an anointed person of God, you choose to fight a war you cannot win, because God comes down in great glory and strengthens that individual to rise up above you. It's a very dangerous situation to be in, to go up against someone that has the anointing of God on their life. Hey, if you like this message and you want to hear more, go ahead and push the like button, the subscribe button. Join the Patreon, patreon.com/grow your faith to support the ministry. And with that being said, God bless you and have a great day.